really interesting topic: growth through insight. So recently, when I was in Taiwan, one of the places that I frequented was the Taipei Fine Arts Center. And one day, as I was walking around the kind of greater area of this big, huge park, I passed a small Hindu temple with a line of people, a pretty long line of people outside. And there was a sign that read Satori and Kensho. And as you heard from me telling last week, I really became, Alexandra, great to see you, honey. Shabbat Shalom. I really became a person of curiosity when I was in Taiwan, and my Google Translate app and Google were always in my hands, right? So I wanted to know what that was. I was curious about it. So I looked up those terms and found that the word Satori meant, it was a Hindu word, and it meant a sudden enlightenment or a revelation. And Kensho, which is what we're going to talk about next week, it actually means an initial awakening or a beginning of awakening, oftentimes through pain. So if we want to look at this from an easy to understand way, if you were a plant and you were to capture your growth, Satori moments would look like kind of what's happening here. There's slight bursts upward, while Kensho growth would have a sort of deep dive, take a bit more effort than to go down and then to go upwards. But as you assimilate the learning in Kensho, you eventually end up with movement upwards. But they're both growth, right? Satori, or insight, which is what we're talking through tonight, is what we would call an aha moment. It's described as a sort of burst of revelation. Now, since Yahweh is in all truth, in fact, all truth originates from him, and this concept I read about from this Hindu temple certainly sounded like truth to me, I started to explore what Hebrew words may be connected with these two concepts that they connected with growth. And I found that Satori is found in the Hebrew concept of the Hebrew word being. And it's actually found in scripture over 170 times. And we're probably very familiar with this concept that being speaks of. So God says to Solomon, because you have made this request, instead of asking long life or riches for yourself or your enemy's death, but rather ask for yourself understanding. This word for understanding is the Hebrew word being. But rather ask for yourself understanding to discern justice. And that's found in 1 Kings 3:11. So basically what God is saying here is, because you didn't ask for selfish things, but rather you asked for being, again, that connects with this concept of the Hindu temple that I saw in Taiwan, Satori, same concept. Understanding is actually the word. And so we want to kind of do a deep dive. Hey, Rebecca, good to see you. Shabbat Shalom. Neats, I think I saw you log on too. Shabbat Shalom. So we're going to look at the word being and kind of do a little bit of a deep dive on that understanding. So here's the word, and it's pronounced being, even though it's B-I-Y-N in our letters. And again, all Hebrew alphabet originally came from the Hebrew pictograph, which is where they would draw pictures of the letters. This is common in many alphabets. And it's spelled Bet Yod, and then at the end is Nun. And each of these letters we can glimpse the meaning of the word from. Now the first one is Bet, and that's the picture of a house or a tent. And what that really means is it's something that's going on inside. The second one is the letter Yod, and that's the picture of an arm, and it means work or make or fashion. And the third pictograph Hebrew letter is the letter Nun, and it's this picture of a seed or a sprout, and it means new life or new generation. Now, what does this mean? It means that we allow for our hearts, what's inside. So you open up your heart, which is what's within, which is the bit, to perceive. And by the way, that takes work, right? That's why the yod is involved. To perceive, to understand, to consider, to discern, and that brings new life. And that's the meaning of the Hebrew word being. Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk, and many of you have probably read his writings before, often writes of the concept of Satori, that Hindu word, or the Hebrew word being, using more familiar Christian language. In the account from his writings, Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander, he has an enlightenment. And he wrote that he was standing on a corner and realized he was, and I'm quoting, a member of the human race. And then he goes on and says, and if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around shining like the sun. They are not they, but my own self. There are no strangers. Then it was as if I suddenly saw the secret beauty of their hearts, the depths of their hearts, where neither sin nor desire nor self-knowledge can reach, the core of their reality. If only they could all see themselves as they really are. If only we could see each other that way all the time. There would be no more war, no more hatred, no more cruelty, no more greed. I suppose the big problem, he writes, would be that we would fall down and worship each other. Now, before you cry blasphemy, what he's talking about is that we would be so blown away by seeing who we've been designed to be as people. We would see the God within all of us, and we would honor the God within all of us and recognize the connections with all of us. So this was Thomas Merton's Satori, or being, or aha moment, when he was just standing on a corner and all of this just came to him. Hey sissy, Shabbat Shalom. And he just had an insight into this, an enlightenment. Satori, or the Hebrew word being, is an insight that changes us forever. And it concerns both the brain and the heart. It's not just learning facts. It's seeing, it's learning, it's experiencing, and it's doing. And I really want you to kind of track with this, because near the end, I'm going to ask you to do this, okay, as we're together, so we can kind of learn how to do it together. So the first time we see this word being in scriptures, and as you know, wherever the first time a word is mentioned, it's called the principle of first mention. When you study the Bible, and it's very important. It connects the meaning of all the rest of the times that the word is used in scriptures. The first time we see being is in Genesis 41, and it is connected to what Joseph is all about and the way he would be overseeing the time of famine in the land of Egypt. And this tells us that being, or insight, not only saves us, it not only saves ourselves when we are open to growth through being, or the Hindu word Satori, it not only saves us and allows us to grow, it saves others and allows them to grow as well. Joseph was willing to use this gift of insight, not merely for his own advancement, but for others even outside of his people. And that resulted in saving everybody from famine, including his own people, thus preserving the lineage of the Messiah. And that's pretty powerful. That's the first time we see the word being used when it describes the understanding of Joseph. And we know how powerful that was for growth. Again, not just for him and not just for his people, but even for the Egyptians. Another time the word being is used is in First Chronicles, verse 12, or chapter 12, and verse 32. And it says, and the children of Issachar, which were men that had understanding, and this is the Hebrew word binah, and it's, again, bin is the root there. This is a derivative of it, of the times to know what Israel ought to do. The heads of them were 200, and all their kinsmen were at their commands. Now, this is interesting because there was only 200 of these people from Issachar, but they all operated, this says, in binah, in understanding, in this kind of insight, understanding, discernment. The word is actually also commonly used in the form that means, and this is really cool, in between. So to see in between. Sages refer to this word as reading between the lines. And Malcolm Gladwell, if you're familiar with him in his book Blink, calls it thin slicing. It's when people are just operating in this insight, this intuition, and they can read between the lines. And they see things that maybe other people around them don't see. And it's an aha moment. In 1 Chronicles 12, David is actually preparing for war. And there's a roll call. And all the tribes converge. And we see that all the tribes, the whole army, was listening to the smaller Issachar clan. So all of the tribes who were fighting this battle with David were listening to just these 200 men, Issachar. And why was this? Because again, they were men who had been satori, understanding, insight of the times. It's really what the world is looking for, right? And the expression here, understanding the times, that is used in this scripture, it's actually a Hebraic idiom. The word times is the Hebrew word anah, and what it means is, it means times and or seasons, but it also means consequences. So in other words, this is one who can thin slice, who can read between the lines, who has an insight of what's really going on and also understands the consequences of actions. In other words, this person can see what actions are going to bring down the road. We see in scripture that being benefits anyone who will see and who will listen to someone with being. Issachar bordered with the tribe of Zebulun. And according to the Jewish scholars, and this is interesting and it kind of shows us the way relationships can work, Zebulun was a very powerful, wealthy tribe of merchants. And Issachar was, again, the tribe of intuitive scholars. And the people of Zebulun were busy with their business, and they didn't really have time to study, and they didn't pause to see. So they helped support Issachar financially so that they could reap the benefits of being. And really, this is the power of this. Not only for your own self, but for other people around you. It really brings growth to everyone. Jewish literature calls Issachar a people in between, which is the Hebrew word being, the flocks. And personally, what I believe is that God all around the world is sort of raising up a people group who operate in this Hebrew concept of being, that they can see, that they can read between the lines, that they can understand the consequences, and that their insight will be attractive to other people. And just like Joseph, they're not only going to save themselves, they're going to save their family, their family's family, their community, the country, even the world, because they can see, they have an intuition. Hey, Chris, great to see you. Shabbat Shalom. In the theological workbook of the Old Testament, the verb refers to knowledge, which is actually superior to just the mere gathering of data, right? It is necessary to know how to use knowledge one possesses, and the Pirkei Avot speaks of this. Being is a power of judgment, and it's a perceptive insight, and it's demonstrated in the use of knowledge. So, do you ever know these people that are just really knowledgeable? I mean, they have read a lot, they know something about almost everything, but they don't have a lot of perceptive insight. They don't have the ability to make righteous judgments. The other thing is about being, it is both insight and acting, which is really important. Similar to Shema, and we've talked about the word Shema a lot, right? Shema is hearing and doing. And if you're not doing, then you didn't really hear. Same with being. Unless you act, you don't really see. Because again, we talked about this is an aha moment, a kind of revelation that changes you. You can't be the same once you have this understanding, just like Thomas Merton was never the same, as we read. Action must take place for being to be present. Albert Einstein, probably a pretty smart guy, right? Also, probably pretty well read, says the only valuable thing is intuition. And coming from him, oh, wow, that's really something. Insight isn't an option, it's vital for growth. So, this concept of growth through insight is very important. And again, I believe, especially in the days we live in, very important. How does one grow in being, in insight? Well, we know a few things. Shabbat Shalom. We're at the school this morning, so we will have to catch up. Oh, the Keysleys are at the school. Love you guys. So how does one grow in being, in insight? Genesis 1:27 says, you are made in the image of God. And that means that we are the mirror of God, right? We can and should be reflecting him to others. And Proverbs 22:27 says the human spirit is a lamp of Adonai. It searches one's inmost being. So being comes from within the house. When we did the word picture, right? The first letter, bet, from within the house. So when you feel like you see something, trust your own heart. Let me ask you this. Does a pine tree seed need to learn how to grow into a pine tree? Does it need to have a seminar? Does it need to have a convention where it talks to the other pine trees because it's not sure how to grow and it wants to be really green and it wants to make sure it's purpose driven? Or does it only need to be put into a healthy environment so its intrinsic nature has the nourishment it needs to grow into its highest expression of design? Everything a pine tree needs, a pine tree seed needs to become a pine tree is within it. And the same with us. The same exact thing with us. So, how to function according to our highest expression of design and grow through being. The first thing, and by the way, I can do a lot of things, but I'm only going to do two things. The first thing is create space. Create a space where insight can happen. And you've heard me talk about this many, many times. And if you missed last week's time together, definitely go back and listen to that curiosity, following after curiosity and forget finding purpose. This is about creating a space where sight and intuition can take place. Environment conducive to insight that creates growth, which means this: it's probably not going to happen when we're too overly busy, even when we're doing good things. We must practice being present, being aware. And again, it's called, when you talk about stillness or mindfulness or whatever you want to call it, it's called a practice because it really takes practice, right? It takes practice. But we talked about this last week. Hey, Evelyn, good to see you. Shabbat Shalom. Love you. We talked about this last week with Moshe, with Moses, When he was called by God to save his people, it happened in a time when he was tending the sheep, and that was his purpose, and that was his focus. And there was a bush on fire, and bushes were always on fire. And because, as I said last week, oftentimes we see what we know, in the desert, if you always see a bush on fire, you're just going to think this is normal. But we have to assume that Moshe was present enough, mindful enough, in the moment enough to notice that the bush wasn't burning up. It caught his attention. It wouldn't have caught his attention if he just quickly passed through it and went, ah, burning bush, I know what that is. And then we read that because he was curious about the burning bush not being consumed, it says in the text, that's when Yahweh spoke to him. That's really powerful. And there's a lot of depth in that. So again, we have to be able to create a space to see. We have to. If we're too busy, we'll never see. Number 2, we need to make connections. And I'm getting ready to give you an exercise, so get ready. Make connections, which is connect the dots. One of the Hebrew parent root words for connections sprouts off into all kinds of other words with different meanings for connections. This is because it's a big Hebraic concept. There's a lot of Hebrew words, and they mean all kinds of things like context, relationships, tying a knot physically, linking, integration, ascribing. Actually, my own granddaughter's name has the parent root of connection in it. And so we see the story and we follow the connections. We see the story. We have to create the space in order to observe, to see. We see the story and then we follow the connections. Now, here's where we're going to get to do something kind of fun, I think. This is by an artist, Felix Gonzalez Torres. And he has done a piece showing 2 clocks. And they are running exactly at the same time. By the second, they are in sync. And they are showing exactly the same time. But here's the interesting thing about this piece. And this is where we're going to pause and we're going to look and we're going to think of the story and we're going to make connections. These clocks in this work of art are run on batteries. Now, take a pause. Look at these clocks. The artist specifically with this piece wants us to relate to this and know that these clocks are run on batteries. What does that mean for the story of these 2 clocks? Let me see your thoughts in the comments. Stop, like we said, look, and think about the story of these 2 clocks running on batteries. And ask yourself, what happens? Because again, Bean talks about the consequences, right? Insight that allows you to see down the road. What happens in these 2 clocks, in the life and the story of these 2 clocks? And what does that mean? And how do we see the consequences of this story in our own life? Now, while you're thinking, I'm going to keep talking, but I'm going to look for your comments and hopefully you'll have some. We all need to be mindful about learning to learn. And so this very simple exercise in looking at these clocks and entering into a story about these clocks and asking ourselves, using Bean, which is to be able to see through things and then see the consequences. What does it mean when these 2 clocks are set exactly to the same time, but they're running on batteries? What does it mean? I don't see any comments. And I'm hoping that there's just a little bit of a lag. But I know it's hard to start thinking like this, but this is very important when we enter into story, that we have insight, and again, that we can see the consequences down the road. So Phoebe says the battery will eventually run out. There you go. And it may run out at a different time on each clock. Good, Phoebe. Good, 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 good. So then what does that mean? What does that mean when the batteries run out? So then that's the first part, what Phoebe said there. The batteries are going to run out so that we can enter into that story. We can look, we can have insight, and we can see. And then when we're still operating and being, we need to know, what does that mean for life? So now you're in this story, which is always how we relate to things that we're looking at for insight, right? We always identify with them, right? This is not just about clocks on batteries. This is about us. This is about our life. What does that mean to us? Alexandra says, shouldn't the batteries have fully charged die at the same time, so the clock should also stop at the same time? Interesting. Apparently, in the actual exhibit, the batteries do not run out at the same time. And in the actual exhibit, since Phoebe already touched on this point, one begins to run slower than the other and then eventually stops. And then the other one also does not keep good time, runs slower, and then stops. So, what does that mean in our life? So, let's say, just to help you out, let's say we're the clock, we're one clock. And let's say there's another person in our life that's the other clock. Or it could be our partner, or it could be a business partner, or it could be friends, or it could be a church, or it could be a community group, or whatever it is. It's that at one point we're in sync, we're going, we're like to the second together, and then all of a sudden something that powers one or both changes, and we're no longer in sync. So then what does that mean as far as the relationship? And I'm going to help you with that. It could mean anything. Okay? It could mean that you would try to get new batteries to bring your partner with you. It could mean that the two of you part ways because you're no longer on the same path. I mean, but this is a story about life. And if we just saw this piece at a gallery and saw that these two clocks were operating at exactly the same time, we would just say, oh, yeah, it's two clocks operating at the exact time. But the artist intentionally wanted us to think again about this and identify, move into the story. Phoebe says, cherish the time we're in sync because we don't know what time will go slower. Exactly. Alexandra says it sounds like our batteries run out at different timings, and once we are so close to the overwhelm point to die out, we suddenly slow down. There's a breaking point. Yes, definitely. Time changes, exactly. But Alexandra says it could be a good thing, and that it takes that much to slow down, right? Hey, there's no right or wrong way to look at these two clocks, right? It's just an art, which all art does, that gets us to think. And what this really does is help us to exercise within, right? Bet within, in order to see and enter into the stories. We all need to be mindful about learning to learn. And so, what happens in the brain when we learn new things with neural pathways and synapses and the brain making connections, it connects literally. This is the amazing thing about the human body in so many ways. When we make connections by observing, by pausing, by creating space, by making the connections, by seeing, by intuition, when we make connections, our brain makes literal connections. When we see connections, we make connections. And we make connections by seeing the story between the lines, which is a really interesting thing that we see physically what's going on emotionally and spiritually. The second part of making connections is asking yourself, and you've heard me say this many times, where have I heard this before? When have I seen this before? What deeper meanings can I draw from this connection? And again, we make meaning by seeing the narrative thread, by observing connections, by connecting the dots. So, being, the Hindu word satori, the English word insight, is how we grow. And being actually is the most fun way to grow. Growth is exhilarating when it comes from making these connections. I was working with a man in this very area of being who was very, very intelligent, a very intelligent man. He was very successful in his business, but unfortunately, he kept losing business relationships because ultimately he didn't understand their expectations of him, and it always sort of really fell apart and got painful and ugly. And he came for counseling because he really wanted to know how to fix that. When we deconstructed a few of the stories, we were actually able to have being or insight, and then make connections, and then see the consequences of action, which is this whole concept of being, the Hebrew word being, growth in being. There were a few common elements within his narrative that happened every single time, and they were connected to him being very, very, very busy, but very nice. So people thought he heard all their nuances when they wouldn't communicate super straightforward, and he co-signed them, but because he was nice. But he was very busy, and he was sort of letting warning signs slip through the radar, and then there would always be this miscommunication. The second, which was really interesting, was the feeling of him being a bit embarrassed about his level of talent and his level of business success. So he always sort of downgraded himself to make others feel better about themselves. And by the way, you can build up other people without tearing down yourself, okay? Truth for the night, right? So then when that happened, they didn't produce because they thought they were okay. And then when they didn't produce for a project, he would have to step in and kind of clean up everything and fix it and make it to his level. And then they would be upset at him. They would be mad at him. They would be jealous of him. Every story of broken relationships that we autopsied together, him and I, had these same elements in them. So now he has insight. He can connect the dots. And then he develops a new business relationship as we're at the end of this learning. And it was developing, and as it was, he was texting me so excited, sharing that he had seen two of the elements that had come up in one day with two people. But this time he saw it first. It was growth through being, through insight. He saw it, he had some good communication about expectations, and he reset the relationships. And these healthy business relationships that he started then exist today in good, healthy partnerships. And along with those healthy partnerships, again, all because of the growth through insight, he was actually the most excited about what he used to call his new gift of insight. Now he could see. He learned how to see. Being. We all have the ability by design. We just need to practice it. Be open. Maybe find a partner to practice with and start making those connections. Shabbat Shalom.